Merry Kissmas, written by USA Today bestselling author Lexy Timms, copyright 2023 by Lexy Timms, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 3, December 3rd. Blair glanced out the car window as she navigated through the streets downtown and saw that the mistletoe was already everywhere, hanging in every doorway and above the old-fashioned archways outside the shops. There were even mistletoe Christmas wreaths on some of the front doors. She groaned inwardly. Between the mistletoe madness and the handsome jerk who had dropped by her store twice in 2 days, she was not in a particularly festive mood. Good thing she decided to come out to try and find a little Christmas cheer. She was now headed to her favorite coffee shop for the holiday treats that only appeared on the menu this time of year. She'd closed Golden Age Antiques for the day, and instead of heading straight home, Blair had ventured out this Saturday for those special once-a-year treats and maybe to do some window shopping. Oh, who was she kidding? She was avoiding her family. Her father and her brothers often seemed to guess when she was at her apartment because they just loved to call her and hound her about her love life. Worse, they'd sometimes stop by unannounced and uninvited. At least out on the road, she had an excuse to dodge them while she made herself busy. Avoiding her family also meant the added bonus of not having to answer the same old "meet anyone new lately" question they always asked. Because she had met someone new. In a strictly platonic sense, of course. His piercing green eyes and wide smile didn't mean anything. This was a business relationship. Still, the newcomer had infuriated her yesterday, and now she couldn't stop thinking about him, as if he was some sort of crush instead of the man who was driving her crazy. He was rude and condescending. The nerve of him to insinuate that her store wasn't good enough. The gall of him to act as if her shop was just a junkyard he could use to dispose of whatever clutter he no longer wanted. Golden Age Antiques wasn't a trash receptacle. It was a place of serious business. Her store might have been small, but it meant something to her and the community. Locals trusted her with their family heirlooms, and they made wonderful finds when they searched through her shop's treasure trove. Too bad the hotshot businessman who had blown into town refused to see that. He was probably too arrogant to truly appreciate what their small town had to offer. Blair brought the car to a stop in front of her favorite coffee shop, Comfort and Joy. Her grip on the steering wheel was so tight that her hands hurt. Geez, just thinking about him had her fuming. Heaving out a breath, she released her hold on the wheel. Blair was here to unwind. Buying some treats from the coffee shop would do the trick and get her into the holiday spirit. Feeling a bit better, she got out of the car and headed into Comfort and Joy. Her spirits lifted the moment she stepped inside. It was warm and cozy, with patrons making orders at the counter, the rest seated and chatting away over steaming cups. The shop was beautifully decorated in bright red bows and Christmas stockings hung up in different locations. Each stocking had an employee's name on it, so customers could leave tips and gifts for the workers. Blair knew the tradition well, and she reached into her bag for a few $10 bills to tip her sometime employee Nancy McLean. It didn't look like Nancy was around, but Blair was glad to leave a small tip for her since Nancy often took lunchtime shifts at the antique store to help her out. Once she'd put the bills into the stocking, she walked up to the counter and made her order. When her order was ready, she grabbed the tray laden with some of her holiday favorites: gingerbread cookies, a cranberry Danish covered in soft powdered sugar, slices of apple, pecan, and maple pie, and finally a peppermint latte decorated with a candy cane and topped with whipped cream. Blair had probably gone overboard, but as she sat down to start sampling the cranberry Danish, she had no regrets. Today's outing was worth it. She took an indulgent sip of her peppermint latte, closing her eyes as she enjoyed the layers of minty flavor and buttery cream. "Hey, Miss Hawthorne, what a coincidence!" No, it couldn't be. Her eyes snapped open. Oh, shizza! It was him. She'd recognize that low baritone anywhere. Standing right next to her table was none other than Mr. Colson himself, the bane of her existence. How had he managed to find her? Blair groaned inwardly. He probably thought she was a loser, eating all by herself with no company. "I have friends," she wanted to insist. In fact, she was going to their town's little one-screen movie theater with her friends later tonight. Why hadn't she bumped into him outside the theater? But no, he'd caught her alone in the coffee shop shoveling food into her mouth. And she was pretty sure that there was whipped cream and powdered sugar on her face. She quickly grabbed a napkin and started dabbing at her nose. Hello. Fancy seeing you here. I was just finishing up some business downtown and thought I'd stop by for a coffee. He gestured to the empty seat opposite her. Waiting for someone? No, not really. Would you like to join me? How about I cover your order? My treat since you helped me set up the tree. Blair felt her face go hot with embarrassment. Why was she blathering on like that? Why had she invited him to sit with her? Maybe she'd been so shocked by his sudden appearance that she just blurted out the first thing that came to mind just to prevent further awkwardness. Only asking him to join her threatened to create far more awkwardness, because she didn't know this man. That's generous of you, he flashed her a dazzling smile and sat down. What would you recommend? When she was sure that she'd wiped the cream and sugar from her face, Blair got her bearings long enough to make suggestions. In the end, he settled on an eggnog coffee and one of the holiday-themed cupcakes decorated to look like a reindeer. When she stretched her hand out to give him the payment, he shook his head. Your money's no good here, Miss Hawthorne, he said. But it's my treat, she insisted. Then he said something that left her absolutely stunned. Can't take money from a beautiful woman now, can I? As her jaw dropped, he winked at her and headed towards the counter to make his order. Her heart pounded in response to his compliment. So he had been flirting with her. Yesterday in her shop, she wondered if the pointed banter between them had ignited a spark. But she'd been able to push the notion aside because, well, he'd been so rude. And too far handsome and worldly to be interested in a small-town plain Jane like her anyway. No, he was messing with her. He must have been. Or maybe he flirted all the time, with everyone. Several minutes later, while she was still trying to figure out his angle, he returned to his seat with his drink and cupcake. He tasted the eggnog coffee. Pretty good. You really should have let me pay, she said. It would have tasted even better then. Nah, he dismissed her with a wave of his large hand. Plus, I know it can be tough for small business owners. Blair narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It means I get how difficult finances must be for businesses in a small town, he replied. Oh, you do you? What exactly do you even do for a living? She demanded, folding her arms to glare at him. Since you're obviously just passing through town, you must have a big fancy job in the city. I'm the VP of a commercial real estate firm in Boston, he muttered. How impressive. No wonder you think so highly of yourself, she said sarcastically. Look, all I meant was that owning a small business is not the same as running a large company. That's really presumptuous of you, Mr. Coulson, she interrupted. He heaved out a frustrated breath. Just Coulson. My small business is exactly as important as your giant company, she said sharply. Maybe even more important because I actually serve a community. I know my customers by name. I know their tastes. To me, they're people, family. Your customers are probably nothing more than lines on a spreadsheet to someone like you. Coulson opened his mouth to retort something, but he paused when he heard the sudden commotion behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. Blair groaned inwardly. She'd noticed the beginning of the ritual out of the corner of her eye a few moments earlier. A young woman had been standing by the coffee shop entrance, making a big show of holding some mistletoe over her head. Now the young man who had walked in noticed her immediately and flashed her a big smile before sweeping her in his arms to give her a big, sloppy kiss. Patrons in the shop hooted and cheered. Somebody wolf-whistled, and Blair just wanted to die. Great. Coulson would probably think the town was provincial and full of insane people. They must have looked as backward as he believed they were. And right when she'd been ranting and raving to set him straight and defend her town. Then she saw a trio of women rush outside into the cold. Blair observed them through the coffee shop window as the women lined up underneath some mistletoe outside. This time she winced. They were risking the chilly weather on the chance that they could get a kiss from a passerby. What's that about? He asked, turning to face her again. Nothing. A silly town custom, she replied with a roll of her eyes. Come on, tell me, he pressed before taking a huge bite of the cupcake. Blair made a face. Okay, so the town has a tradition. You know how people kiss if they end up under mistletoe? He nodded. Yeah, I've seen it in movies and stuff. Well, every Christmas here in Mislin Bush, we put the mistletoe everywhere, and people follow through with the tradition. That's where the town gets its name. Mislin Bush is another name for mistletoe, she explained with an aggravated shake of her head. It's so absurd. They'd probably shoot a Hallmark movie here if they knew this place existed. I think it's charming, he said. What? Her mouth fell open. Are you serious? That's what you like about this town?
Well, yeah, every town has its quirks, correct?
Oh, but it was more than a harmless quirk. It was the annual nightmare that drove her nuts for weeks. She'd be dodging mistletoe and men from now until Christmas, only to repeat the insanity all over again next year. I guess, she grumbled.
So, what's dating in a small town like? He asked.
Heat flashed in his eyes that turned into appreciation, like he was taking her in and deciding that his question applied to her specifically, just as much as it did the town's dating scene. Blair started quivering all over. The way he was gazing at her made her guess that he was probably thinking something that neither of them should be thinking. She felt her face flush, and for a second, she couldn't concentrate. It took several tries for her to start thinking clearly again. His question had caught her completely off guard. Blair felt the sweat forming on her brow as Coulson looked directly at her, his green eyes holding her in place. He was asking about her love life. That was the only explanation for his sudden interest in the town's dating scene. It was either interest in her love life or an inexplicable desire to get the lay of the land, which didn't make sense because he didn't live here. Even if he was single like she guessed, he'd be back in Boston soon enough. No need for him to look for a romance all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. Still, there was an intensity behind his eyes, as if he was genuinely curious about her response. If she told him the truth, she risked looking like a complete loser. But what did she care? She was not remotely interested in trying to impress this all-too-handsome stranger. Besides, the truth would likely scare him off if he really had been flirting with her earlier. There was no time like the present to put an end to this before things heated up any further. Coulson watched her as he waited impatiently for her answer. The truth was, he'd asked about dating in Mislin Bush because he wanted to know her relationship status. Blair didn't wear a ring on her finger, so he was pretty sure she wasn't married. But she might have a significant other. He wanted to make sure so that he didn't overstep. Damn, he hoped she was single. The thought of her having a boyfriend was too much to bear. Mounting jealousy was in danger of turning into illogical anger at the thought of some guy getting to have her all to himself. Sitting across from her in such close proximity had made him realize that this couldn't be strictly business. As much as he wanted to keep things professional, Coulson felt himself slipping around her. He wasn't in work mode with Blair. He wasn't smoothly negotiating or ruthlessly trying to close a deal. There was a connection here. It was deeper than his mindless hookups. Too bad he couldn't go beyond flirting. If it weren't for his busy life and the long distance, Coulson would be taking her to dinner tonight, inviting her into his bed for dessert. Alas, playful banter was all he could risk. But she was worth that risk. Based on that flush in her cheeks alone, he was certain she felt something too. Dating? She averted her gaze and started picking at the pastry on her plate. It's fine. Same as any small town. Care to elaborate? He asked gently. I'm not familiar with small town courting rituals. Everybody knows everybody, so I tried online dating to meet guys from nearby towns, she said. That way I'd get to meet people I haven't known since elementary school. How did that turn out? She tore the pastry into even smaller pieces. I had to pause all that to focus on work. Married to the job, he said knowingly. I get that. Same for me. Your job's prevented you from settling down? She asked, leaning forward. Coulson wanted to say yes. He wanted to blame overwork, but being a bachelor at the age of 33 when his parents had gotten married in their early 20s was a choice. So he knew deep down that he was hiding behind his high-powered corporate job. It was much easier to walk away from any relationship that started getting too serious if he used work as an excuse. Who could hold it against him? He was a Bennett, after all. His father's side of the family had been part of the upper class for over 100 years now. They had shaped the social and business landscape on the East Coast for a long time. Meanwhile, one side of his mother's family fought in the Revolutionary War. The Bennetts and the people they married were not ordinary people, hence Coulson having cold feet for all of his adult life. His family wanted him to marry a certain type of woman, and that type bored him to death. If he chose the upper-class bride his parents approved of, Coulson was sure he'd resent the whole situation forever, and yet, ever since his great-grandmother's death, he couldn't help feeling as if there was something missing in his life.
Yes, it has. Work gets in the way, he said finally, giving her the half-truth. He couldn't reveal the whole truth because that level of honesty would scare her off. Talking about his fear of commitment and the reasons for it would scare off any woman. The job keeps me so busy that there's no real time to get serious with anyone. But I assume that dating in a small town would be easier than dating in a big city.
Wow, look at us. Both single at Christmas, she said.
Does the town's tradition say if that's good or bad?
Blair shrugged. Not sure, though my family reminds me every year now.
Sounds like my family, he admitted. When I do take women out, they say I need to slow down. If I'm too busy to see anybody, my parents tell me to speed things up. Can't win.
So, I'm not the only one dealing with family pressure, she said softly.
His chest tightened as he realized what he had done. He confessed something that he hadn't really put into words before. And not only had she heard him, but she also hadn't judged him for it. It had been a long time since he'd been this vulnerable with anyone, and he was amazed because he barely knew her. When he'd spotted her in the coffee shop earlier, he'd been so surprised to see her. He couldn't pass up the opportunity to be in her presence. Coulson had thought that if he sat with her and talked briefly, that he'd be able to smooth things over between them, charm her so that she'd let go of some of her hostility towards him. Instead, his charm offensive had failed. He'd pissed her off again. Then he'd dropped his usual smooth talking and just opened up to her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Coulson was stunned. How the hell had she managed to do all that? He chanced another look at her. Their eyes met. She blushed again, her cheeks turning a rosy pink. Seeing her react to him made his chest tighten. That was why he was able to let his guard down with her. Maybe not completely, but enough to feel like a new man when he was near her, which meant that she was dangerous to him. Blair was so sincere and honest that she could very easily get past his defenses. She could get him to toss professionalism out a window. Flirting would be the least of his problems because he could absolutely see himself taking things further in a moment of weakness. As if on cue, she shifted in her chair and her slender leg brushed against his. He saw her blush deepen as she jumped back, clearly surprised at the contact. Coulson had to suppress a groan as her leg slid against his when she drew back. He started sweating, and no matter how hard he tried to keep his emotions in check, his mind was spinning. If he didn't wrench back control, he was liable to say something incredibly stupid. "Since you know the town so well, I was wondering if you could show me around," he said.
Yeah, something stupid like that. Blair's eyes widened. Show you around town? Aren't you just passing through?
I'll be here until New Year's. He sensed she was giving him an opportunity to take it back, but he didn't want to. He'd only back off if she rejected him. All the more reason for me to get a tour, right?
That's a good point, she raised an eyebrow, regarding him suspiciously. If I take you on a tour, you don't get to disparage the town.
I haven't disparaged it, he said defensively.
Oh, right. It's just my story you've disparaged.
I'm trusting you with my family's antiques, aren't I?
She laughed, the sound so beautiful that it stirred something in him. When would you like to take this tour? We can't take a tour tomorrow since I'll be busy buying replacement Christmas lights.
I can go with you, he said, cutting her off.
What?
Show me where to buy lights, he said. That's a good start for a tour.
Oh, my goodness, she shook her head. The hardware store is the worst place for a tour.
Seriously doubt that if you're going to be the one taking me around, he countered. She blushed again.
All right, fine. I can't believe you've talked me into this.
But she was smiling when she said it. Looked like some of his charm was finally starting to work. Great. We can work out a time, he said. And don't forget that we're supposed to set up a day for you to stop by. I've sent photos to my family for their feedback, so I'll know which antiques to keep and which ones to sell when everyone has the chance to get back to me.
Do you have photos right now? She asked.
He nodded and reached into his jacket pocket for his phone. Yeah, have a look. Coulson shared the photos with her while they continued eating. By the time he was finished showing her, another 20 minutes had passed, and he remembered that he still had errands to run and business to complete before the end of the day.
I should be getting home, Blair said as she finished her coffee.
How about I walk you to your car, he offered.
That's very chivalrous, she said, a note of surprise in her tone. Any excuse to be near her, even briefly.
We have manners in Boston, too, you know. he said wryly. That made her laugh again, and once she packed up her things, he walked with her out of the coffee shop. On the way out, she paused to put some money in a stocking. It's for the staff, she explained. Coulson followed her lead, putting $1,000 into a small green stocking near the door. As he escorted her to her mid-sized sedan, Coulson recognized the trio of women standing on the sidewalk. All three of them were shivering and started to make for the coffee shop entrance. They eyed him hopefully as they shuffled past, and he realized that meant that not only had they been waiting for a kiss, but they also seemed to want a kiss from him specifically. At that moment, he decided that the best thing to do would be to wrap his arm around Blair, just for a second, so they'd understand that he wasn't going to be taking part in the mistletoe tradition. All three women looked at him with forlorn looks in their eyes as they marched into the shop. Blair leaned against him suddenly, a subtle sign that she welcomed having his arm around her. In his haste to get the women to back off, he'd forgotten that Blair might respond to the gesture. Not that he minded, but because the truth was, there really was only one woman in the whole town he wanted to kiss.